There is a moment in global politics when words stop being commentary and quietly begin to function as instruments. Not metaphors, not warnings, instruments. That moment is usually easy to miss because it doesn't arrive with explosions or emergency sirens. It arrives wrapped in familiar phrases, spoken with practiced confidence, delivered as if nothing extraordinary is happening. But this time, something shifted. The language changed weight. The pauses grew heavier, and what sounded like rhetoric started to behave like a countdown. What was said did not sound like diplomacy. It did not even sound like pressure in its usual sense. It sounded measured, almost casual, but every formulation carried a precise implication. When phrases about time running out appear alongside references to overwhelming force, this is no longer a debate about intentions. It is a recalibration of reality. And this is where the main thing begins. Because when a leader deliberately mentions a massive naval presence, not as background, but as a central element of the message, it stops being decoration. It becomes structure. A signal designed to be read correctly by everyone who knows how such language works, especially by those who are not supposed to respond publicly. The mention of a carrier group is never accidental. It is not there to impress the audience at home. It is there to change the behavior of someone elsewhere, to force calculations, to introduce urgency, to compress time. And when the same message includes reminders of previous strikes, previous operations, previous exceptions, it stops sounding like a warning and starts resembling a rehearsal. What makes this moment particularly unsettling is the choice of comparison. When past interventions are brought into the present conversation, it is rarely nostalgia, it is precedent, a way of saying this has already been normalized once. The threshold has already been crossed, and what was possible then remains possible now. They usually keep quiet about this part, but the reference is not aimed at the opponent alone. It is aimed at everyone watching how far the rules can bend before they break. The arrival of a specific aircraft carrier in the region is not just a military movement. It is a political sentence written in steel, a floating argument that doesn't need to be explained. For Iran, it is a reminder of vulnerability. For allies, it is a test of loyalty. For the domestic audience, it is reassurance that control has not been lost. One object, multiple messages, all delivered simultaneously. This is why fleets appear before shots are fired. Pressure works best when it still has deniability. But there is another layer here, one that looks like a detail until you put it all together. The sudden return to old operational names, old strike narratives, old success stories. This is not about history. It is about psychology, about conditioning expectations, about planting the idea that repetition is easier than escalation, that if something was done once and survived politically, it can be done again with fewer consequences. Against this backdrop, the response from Tehran sounds deliberately restrained, carefully calibrated. Dialogue is mentioned but not submission. Readiness is declared but not fear. The emphasis on mutual respect is not rhetorical flourish. It is a refusal to accept the frame being imposed. A way of saying that negotiations under coercion are not negotiations at all. And this is precisely where the language sharpens. Because when Iranian officials shift from diplomatic vocabulary to openly military phrasing, it is not an outburst. It is a message. References to previous conflicts, to short wars that taught long lessons, are not meant to intimidate the public. They are meant to reach planners, to signal that escalation is not unthinkable, and that experience has been accumulated quietly. The nuclear issue, as always, sits at the center like a locked mechanism everyone pretends to understand. Peaceful use is emphasized again and again, not because it convinces opponents, but because it defines red lines internally. And this is where the misalignment becomes dangerous. One side hears stalling, the other hears survival. One side speaks in deadlines, the other speaks in principles, and neither believes the other is truly listening. So, what is actually happening right now? Is this diplomacy conducted through threat? Or is it the slow, methodical preparation for a strike that has not yet been named? Both sides appear to leave themselves an exit, a rhetorical ramp back to talks. And yet, every new statement raises the cost of using that exit. Every movement reduces room for error. Every comparison tightens the space. The region does not need a deliberate decision to ignite. It only needs an incident, a misread signal, a proxy acting independently, a moment where restraint is interpreted as weakness. And the most dangerous part is that all the pieces are already in place. The words have been spoken, the forces are positioned, the timelines have been hinted at. What remains unclear is not whether the situation is serious. That much is obvious. The real uncertainty lies elsewhere. At what point does pressure stop being reversible? And who decides in the final moment whether stepping back is still an option or whether there is no one left who can afford to retreat? From this point forward, the logic becomes less theatrical and more mechanical. What looks like emotional rhetoric on the surface is, in fact, a sequence of constraints being quietly assembled. Each statement narrows the range of acceptable outcomes. Each movement removes one more illusion of spontaneity. This is no longer about persuading the other side. It is about shaping the environment in which decisions will be made. The fleet is not there to start a war. That is the part everyone says out loud. The part they usually keep quiet about is that the fleet's real function is to make non-action costly. Once a carrier group is in place, once logistics are deployed, once allies are aligned around a visible posture, backing away begins to look like retreat rather than restraint. And that distinction matters. It matters domestically. It matters institutionally. It matters to every actor who has already adjusted their expectations to the presence of force. This is how pressure systems work. They don't explode immediately, they harden. They lock in commitments without formal declarations. A carrier at sea becomes a promise that cannot easily be withdrawn without explanation. A phrase about time running out becomes a deadline, even if no date is attached. And references to previous operations are not nostalgia, they are insurance. They pre-justify repetition, stify. Iran understands this structure perfectly well. That is why its responses avoid panic but refuse submission. Dialogue is kept on the table, but only in a way that denies the legitimacy of ultimatums. The insistence on mutual respect is not diplomatic etiquette. It is a rejection of asymmetry. A way of stating that talks conducted under threat will be treated as invalid regardless of outcome. This stance is not designed to calm the situation. It is designed to prevent internal fracture. The sharper tone from Tehran's military voices serves a different function. It is not aimed at Washington's public statements. It is aimed at assumptions. Assumptions about thresholds. Assumptions about red lines. Assumptions that experience fades with time. When past conflicts are invoked, it is not to relive them, but to remind planners that escalation has memory, that responses are not improvised, that there is institutional muscle memory built precisely for moments like this. The nuclear issue remains the central not because it is the only element both sides can claim as existential. For Washington, it is framed as prevention. For Tehran, as sovereignty. These positions are structurally incompatible under coercive conditions. One side demands guarantees before trust, the other demands trust before guarantees. And as long as the conversation is conducted through pressure rather than parity, this loop cannot be resolved. What makes the current phase particularly dangerous is not aggression, but sequencing. Pressure is being applied before consensus exists on what outcome would actually count as success. The fleet signals readiness. The rhetoric signals urgency. But the end state remains deliberately vague. That ambiguity is useful at first. It allows flexibility. Over time, it becomes a liability. Because once action replaces language, ambiguity collapses. Every escalation scenario in the region shares one common feature. It does not require intent. It requires alignment of misinterpretations. A proxy move interpreted as state policy, a defensive action read as provocation, a warning ignored because it sounded too familiar. And in a system already saturated with force, reaction time shrinks to minutes, not days. All sides claim they want to avoid war. That statement can be true and irrelevant at the same time. Systems move according to momentum, not desire. And momentum is built quietly through deployments, phrases, precedents, and silence. At some point, the question stops being who wants escalation and becomes who can still stop it without losing control. This is not the edge of war in the dramatic sense. It is the edge in the structural sense, where choices still exist, but each one carries a cost that someone must accept publicly. And the longer this configuration holds, the fewer actors remain capable of absorbing that cost. The world is watching a familiar pattern assemble itself again, but familiarity does not reduce risk. It increases complacency. The mechanisms are in place. The language has hardened. The exits are still visible, but narrower than they appear. And the most unsettling possibility is not that someone will choose conflict deliberately, but that the system will arrive there without anyone formally deciding to go. What is still missing from most public interpretations is the economic and infrastructural layer that sits beneath the military choreography. Naval deployments and ultimatums are only the visible surface. Underneath, there is a dense network of energy routes, insurance markets, shipping corridors, and financial exposure that reacts faster than armies ever do. Even the suggestion of escalation in the Persian Gulf begins to distort risk calculations far beyond the region. Freight rates adjust. Insurers quietly rewrite clauses. Energy traders hedge not against war, but against uncertainty. And uncertainty in this system is often more destabilizing than conflict itself. Iran's leverage has never been limited to missiles or nuclear centrifuges. It lies in geography and timing. The ability to affect choke points, even indirectly, introduces a multiplier effect that military planners must factor in long before any strike. This is why rhetorical escalation is paired with naval signaling. It is not about confrontation alone. It is about controlling secondary consequences. And yet, those secondary consequences are precisely the ones least controllable once events begin to move. There is also the question of internal political cycles. Pressure applied externally is never isolated from domestic constraints. Statements framed as strength abroad are often designed to neutralize vulnerability at home. The danger emerges when foreign policy becomes a mechanism for stabilizing internal narratives. In that configuration, backing down stops being a strategic choice and starts looking like a political risk. This is when language hardens further, not because options disappear, but because admitting flexibility becomes costly. Iran faces its own internal equation. Economic strain, regional commitments, and long-term strategic patience pull in different directions. Public restraint serves one audience. Signals of readiness serve another. Maintaining coherence between them requires careful calibration. Any perception of weakness externally risks fragmentation internally. That is why responses remain firm even when escalation is not desired. Silence in such moments is often interpreted as consent. Another underestimated factor is the role of third actors who benefit from prolonged tension without bearing direct responsibility for its outcome. Proxy dynamics are not random. They are incentivized. As pressure builds between major players, peripheral actors gain space to maneuver, provoke, or extract concessions. This further erodes clarity about intent. Responsibility diffuses, attribution becomes contested, and escalation pathways multiply. At this stage, the conflict is not moving toward resolution or explosion, it is moving toward saturation, a point where signals lose precision because there are too many of them. When everything sounds like a warning, nothing does. This is historically the most unstable phase. Not because leaders are irrational, but because systems overloaded with signals begin to misfire. The critical risk is not that negotiations fail. Negotiations often fail. The risk is that failure becomes normalized while pressure continues to accumulate. In such an environment, even de-escalatory gestures can be misread as tactical pauses rather than strategic shifts. Trust does not erode loudly. It erodes quietly through repetition. What remains is a narrow corridor where restraint still functions, but only if exercised decisively and early. Delay favors momentum, and momentum, once detached from intention, is notoriously difficult to reverse. The situation no longer hinges on bold moves, but on the ability to interrupt patterns that have already begun to repeat themselves. Whether that interruption will come from calculation, exhaustion, or external shock is still unclear. What is clear is that the system is now testing its own limits, and history suggests that such tests rarely end cleanly,